everybody. Thanks for watching this episode of HITRUST Secrets. I'm Sue Richards, joined with Donna Dodson and Steve Dufour. But Donna said she had some updates from some prior questions and prior demos. So let's start with Donna.
Right. So I spoke with High Trust earlier. There was a question that came up over the past week because we had a vendor, a big vendor, and they have refused to provide their High Trust report, the detailed High Trust report. And then there was quite a bit of runaround even getting the detailed SOC 2 report. In this case, the vendor had two, so there was one to fall back on. But as the client I'm working with is seeking high trust, obviously they hold high trust in high regard and would prefer to see that report. So there was some back and forth and concerns about the decline to share the report, not for inheritance or reliance, but for vendor due diligence. And this is specific to controls that say you're required to receive these reports and your leadership team has to review them. And you have to demonstrate that the leadership team has reviewed them. And so this was the concern. So I have subsequently raised that inquiry through High Trust, and I had a conversation with Ida and Vincent earlier. So this got, in my opinion, it got quite interesting. I don't know. These are the things that fascinate me. So I went through the conversation with them, talked to them about, what my client's concerns were, because they said, it's not unusual that this particular vendor, and I don't want to highlight them because it's not about the vendor specifically, but they're a large vendor in the cloud provider space. And so, they dictate the contracts, right? Exactly. Clients, especially smaller organizations, are not in a position to say, can you please include this in the BAA, or can you please say that you're always going to have high trust, in the contract provisions? That's simply not how it works. So, talking through all of these things with Ida and Vincent, and they have confirmed that vendors are not required to provide security reports, the detailed security assessments. Fundamentally not required. And in order to satisfy the related controls, this particular client is going through an E1, and there is one control in domain 14. So they have to get a good score, right? It's critical. And it was confirmed directly from High Trust that they are not required to obtain security assessment reports or have their leadership team review them as part of this control. The sufficient, I'm going to read this from the email that I sent as a follow-up, because of course I put it in writing. So evidence demonstrating appropriate vendor security measures as part of vendor obligation are like contractual security commitments aligned with the nature of the vendor engagement, and evidence that the vendor maintains a relevant certification or assessment on an ongoing basis is considered sufficient. So in case anybody, that's new news to anybody else, and I'd be curious to hear, what you've heard from your assessors, because I've always been brought through the paces as we need the security reports and we need evidence that your leadership team has reviewed them on an annual basis. And that's part of vendor due diligence, even when there's inheritance through my CSF and that sort of thing. So I'm super curious about everybody else's reactions and responses to this.
Whenever I was reviewing on an annual basis, or whenever onboarding a third party or any particular thing where I needed to review some kind of report, more often, actually, there might have only been one case where there was a high trust report. The rest of them were either ISO 27001, but more often SOC 2 type 2. So I really appreciate SOC 2 type 2 because you can have like the letter from the assessor, or you have the full report where it says like this particular control. I really appreciate the control because then I can pinpoint one particular control that failed. And if the management comments at the very end say, we agree with this and we have a plan, then I can specifically follow up on that plan. Like, hey, well, what's the status of the plan? I have a question. So if they're not able to or willing to send the full report, would it be prudent to ask them specific questions about the control? Like, so for example, like if one control, like change management is super important to you, say, okay,
Mhm.
well, I understand you don't want to send the whole report because you might see a whole bunch of red marks on there or something like that, which might put the contract in jeopardy. So has anybody ever asked a status of a particular control? Like just screenshot me the comments from the report or anything like that, or is it an all or nothing thing?
I mean, high trust reports not supposed to be provided like that.
Right.
Um, just anecdotally, I'm not saying that pertains to SOC 2s. Anyone else?
Well, it's interesting because the way I was just looking up that for that E1, that third party assurance, and for the sample testing, HITRUST is requiring that you look at that somebody in the organization reviewed at least one independent evaluation. And that would be a certification, attestation, or audit report. So it's not necessary that you necessarily would have to look through from a high trust perspective. It's not necessary that you'd have to look through the whole entire high trust report if somebody says they're high trust certified. However, I think there was somebody out, I think it was Richard Reben, who's been on our high trust secrets before, just had a LinkedIn post about that where he wanted to dig deeper into a vendor, not because high trust was requiring them to dig deeper, but just for doing due diligence of the audit reports. And they wanted to do that and the person refused, but they did give them their SOC 2. And he said the SOC 2 was a qualified report. And so the qualifications, the things that the auditor had found were exactly what vendor, what Richard as the auditor was worried about from this vendor. So I don't know that it's necessarily high trust requires it, but to your point, Stephen, you may want to, as an organization, require it, especially if you are getting that feeling that that vendor's being less than forthcoming with things. Um, we've always in the past when I worked at a business associate, we would always offer to let them see it through a conversation, so we could have a live discussion with them, show them the report, and they could drill down into here are the pieces that you're worried about. And it's
Sure.
true. I mean, I know you want to win the business, but at the same time, you don't want to misrepresent. And if so, if you're, a specific thing that's really, really important to a potential client, you're just not there, you've got to be honest and say, yeah, we're not there. We're remediating it. Maybe our backup schedule isn't, at this specific ideal. It's enough to get a passing score, but it's not an A plus. And, therefore, you kind of want to, it may not be high trust requires it, but it may be you as an organization. You've been burned before by another vendor, so you want to make
Yeah.
sure that vendor, that new one that you're looking at, doesn't have the same issue.
Yeah. I mean, I see it as like a home inspection report. It doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to walk away from the house, but I want to know what I'm getting into, right? So
Exactly.
that's why the detail is important. And that's why when looking at a new vendor or looking at a vendor on behalf of a client, I will insist on a detailed report for any vendor that we're considering because I need to know what we're getting into and where their controls may fall short. And we have to make sure that we take additional steps or maybe restrict permissions or integration
Hmm.
somehow to make sure that we are, in fact, meeting our requirements as an organization and not inadvertently exposing ourselves to something down the food chain of it. So that's where, I definitely lean hard on the detailed reports. And I have also joined calls with organizations that didn't want to send their high trust report, and that's fine. But in this case, I was just very curious because, like I said, the vendor in question has high trust, and I was interested to understand, like, do they have an agreement with high trust where they don't have to provide this? And what I discovered is no vendors have to provide it.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And so I just thought that was really interesting. And it definitely changes the context of this control. And so I sent out something in writing as a follow up to make sure that I've understood it correctly. And then I also shared that with the assessor so that we can get aligned on, okay, what does the client actually have to provide to meet the assessment, the fully mature assessment of this control.
So, Donna, I guess I have a question. I would guess
Sure.
that the answer is no, but I don't know that. So, this control, I mean, are there any third-party risks associated with this? Because if we don't know what the risk is, that we don't have a detailed report, is there a third-party risk out there, or a third party, fourth party, nth party risk is what I'm getting at.
So a little unknown. There's nothing showing up on inheritance. Again, the organization is going through an E1 and not an I1 or an R2.
Yeah.
So there could be other controls, which we don't have straight line visibility on, which might be not as mature as they should be. But there's nothing that's come back in inheritance to suggest that they're falling short of any of those controls. I mean, like I said, I'm going to go back to my statement at the beginning. It's a big player
Yes.
in the cloud world. So with that in mind, there's very little my client can do about it other than it would be nice to know if they were falling short so that my client, if they felt like it was necessary or appropriate, could take steps.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, because your HITRUST certification letter doesn't say you're certified with corrective actions, and here are the corrective actions.
Right.
So you don't know, you may not be at a passing score, but it's again, I think because Ryan Patrick was on probably back September or so, and it said, if anybody ever says they won't accept your HITRUST certification, Ryan's willing to get on the phone and talk through that with them. So, if anything, there's somebody going to bat for the vendor who's reluctant to show the entire report and just say, look, it's certified. Yes, there may be some deficiencies, but they're under control to the point where a external third party whose reputation is on breach rates has said they're comfortable with the remediation that we're doing and the progress that we're making.
Yeah. It does feel a little awkward that you like got to ask about specific controls rather than being provided with a list of caps. And maybe there's a method. Is there a method for obtaining just a list of caps? Because I'm not aware of HITRUST issuing reports where you could provide just your list of caps to a client.
No, and
So
that was always when I was a business associate. Yeah, they always wanted, that's where they wanted to see it. They're like, okay, you got
yes.
certified, but where are your deficiencies if you have any? And,
Yeah.
We couldn't parse out and just say, okay, I'm going to give you the letter, the scope, and Appendix B or whatever, which is the corrective actions.
Yeah.
Because HITRUST's like, nope, you send them the whole thing or you send them just the letter.
Yeah.
And I'm like,
And I think I saw the same LinkedIn post that you did, Susan, which is, this person asked for the HITRUST report. The vendor said no. They were told they just have I1 certification. And then they, sought the SOC 2 report, which collectively, when you ask people who are pursuing HITRUST, they generally rely on HITRUST as a first choice. And the SOC 2 report in this case said, that there was a deficiency. And the concern then becomes, can you comfortably rely on someone's HITRUST certification just as a blind certification if there's no transparency on deficiencies? Because if not, then we're back in the I still need my SOC 2, and hopefully I've chosen an assessor who's strong. Because then the SOC 2 is the only place we're getting that information.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a dilemma for sure.
Frustrating.